So wonderful. Oh my God. And we're just gonna, as people are gathering, welcome to this Freedom Rising Salon. Ben is the most amazing curator who doesn't take credit for it, but he really does help set a beautiful table for these conversations. And it's just as you come today, why don't you tell us where you are at? That's my granddaughter's favorite question. Where you are at, and what she really means is where you're standing or where you're sitting or where you live. But I think where you are at might also be, what did you bring with you today? Like, what kind of mood are you in? How you doing? So where you are at, right? Write in the chat and tell us where you are at.
And this is TL with the reminder to grab water or whatever might serve your needs in this moment.
TL and I have been having already a robust conversation about where our people are from, how dry our hands may or may not be, and how we're going to have this conversation. So I think I was just surprised, TL, thinking what I need right now was I needed a little laughter, just a little pickup right there. That was really great to get that with you. It was wonderful.
Yeah,
So
this is TL. You help. Before we dive in, I just wanted to name for folks that we also have live captions happening. I'm going to drop the link in the chat for people who want to follow along with the captions.
Thank you, TL, for doing that. And this is TL with no pronouns. And TL, where are you at?
Yeah, this is TL. So, and I'll explain to people, and I'll explain to you, Jacqui, because we haven't had time to talk about that because we've been joking about all sorts of other things. I'll say my name before I comment, and then you, Jacqui, will say your name before you comment, and it helps with access so everyone knows who's communicating at any given time, both in text, well, thrice in text, in speech, and in sign. It's very helpful. Cool. I see some people coming on screen. That's great. It's up to you if you want to jump in. I'll give a quick image description of myself. I hide my self view. So I am a Black person with pretty short hair, square-ish rimmed glasses, and I have on an orange shirt and my favorite Black sweater that comes up past my neck. And I'm seated in a room with like white walls and a couple of pieces of art and a sofa behind me. I am pretty exhausted right now, but in a much better place than I have been in a number of years. And I think we'll probably talk more about that. I'm physically seated on unceded, no pun intended, unceded Tongva land in what is colonially known as Northern Los Angeles.
Thank you, Till. And this is Jacqui. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am going to tell you that I am wearing, I am a Black person as well, with slightly caddish red glasses on and dreadlocks that are to my shoulders. And I have on a red lip because it makes me feel better. And a cross that belonged to my mom, kind of silver, with a little fake diamond in there. And a multicolored orange and blue kind of kimono, and also an orange t-shirt. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Denver that I just arrived in, and I'm sad to say that I don't know exactly whose land this is, but I know it doesn't belong to Denver. But I'm here in a Westin hotel having this conversation with TL. And we do want to get into, how have you been? Can we start there? Does that feel okay? I mean, we got questions for TL, and I'm wanting to have a real conversation, and so does TL, about how this conversation about ableism is a conversation about life. And every single thing that we do as unconscious people, and that's me, I'm putting myself right in the middle of that, language we use, space we create, what we don't say, how we're not aware, how we wound people because we're just not conscious. And I just want us to get more conscious, and I want to be like the leader of Get More Conscious today. So I hope that you all will join into this conversation with us with your questions in the chat. We'll make some time to talk to us, but you know, TL and I are both Black. So sometimes as Black people teaching people, you can just feel some kind of way about it. But that's what we're gonna do anyway, right? Is do some teaching and try not to feel like put upon. But TL, you said earlier when we were laughing about my ashy hands, that you've been exhausted and you just stopped. Can you just say how it came to be that you stopped to take care of yourself, what got you tired, and what we should all be thinking about right now, about how we do our bodies? Is that, I would love to do that. You say, Jacqui, that's too much, but that's my question.
I'll start with ableism.
Mhm.
We are taught from a very early age not to care for our needs under the current capitalist system.
Mhm.
For example, we applaud perfect attendance, even for children who are in immense pain. Show up every day, regardless of how you're feeling.
Right.
We punish children for caring for their needs, i.e. eating during class.
Right.
Or needing to go to the bathroom. Gotta get permission, hold your bathroom. Now's not the time for the break, right? Like, so there's a lot of issues there, right? We discipline children for asserting autonomy, for example. Hey, I didn't appreciate it when you touched me so roughly, or when you violated my personal space. And not just children, right? We could name any marginalized group of people who doesn't get the right to dictate things about their own body.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm talking about like what we are taught in the US context, by and large. Yes, these are large sweeping statements, but I think they are largely and sweepingly true.
Yes.
That we punish children for existing as themselves. You're talking too loud, you're running too fast, stay in the house, don't go there. Like there is punishment for like freedom. Yeah. And what that causes people to do is become, in many cases, obsessed with working nonstop or getting the A, like excelling in particularized ways that might not even meet their body or mind's needs, yeah. Right? So maybe the student who doesn't fare well in the class was never meant to be in that class, not that the child failed the class, but that the entire system failed the child. But if the metrics we use to determine someone's worth or value, in this case, children, are based on adult standards of what it means to be of value, so making that A, then the child who makes the C or the child who makes the F is taught they didn't work hard enough. And maybe they worked harder than the child who achieved the A, right? But maybe they were caring for their children, their parents' other children. Maybe they were in the midst of immense trauma. Maybe the United States had engaged in war in their communities. Like there's all sorts of number of reasons why a person might not fare well on an exam. Not to mention that exam shouldn't be the metric of someone's worth or value, especially children. So from an early age, I, like most of the rest of us who exist in the so-called United States, was taught that it's really important to work hard, especially as a Black person, right? We're told we have to work harder, and we do.
Yeah.
You work harder than other people just to be seen as equal. That's what we're told. Like, and it is true. Like, right, there is truth in that, unfortunately. But all of that really centers around ableism and the ideas about value of various groups of people. So ideas even about thinking about, I'm a Black, queer, disabled person. Trans also, I'm non-binary. So I'm on the trans spectrum. And having those other marginalized identities often makes me want to work even harder to prove my worth, right? So, and everyone around me is dropping, right? Like real death, like real urgencies, real emergencies. And I have power and privilege in particular areas that a lot of people around me don't. And I'm a hyper empath. Part of at least one of my disabilities is to be hyper sensitive. So when you arrived on the screen, Jacqui, before you told me all of what was going on, and even though I had gotten a little bit of context from Ben, I already knew that there was going to need to be check-ins. I was sensing, I was seeing things, right? That's how my body mind functions.
Yeah.
And so being hyper aware and hypersensitive to our environment often means that we feel and see more, and we have to then engage in more work to try to quell the harms that are happening around us, because that also helps me. The problem therein lies that we are dealing with systems and structures that are immensely powerful, that are backed by so many resources, that when we as individuals try to do that, it's a great way to work yourself literally to death. And that's just in my case, but I want to name also that because the work I've been doing has been for free, I say I've been fighting for freedom. I have not asked for money to do the abolition work that I've been doing for 15 years, which means for me that I've had to have jobs on top of this heavy advocacy where people are passing away, people are being brutalized, and I'm dealing with that on top of my own traumas and things that are happening that don't get dealt with because I'm busy doing the work, right? The work becomes the only thing you can see.
Right.
And yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, this is Jacqui.
And so when that happens, what we're doing is feeding into this idea of like, I need to produce or I need to fix things to be of value. Not to say that that was the reason why I was engaged in that activity. I was engaged in it for freedom and for life, right? Like my own included.
Yeah.
And even with the type of work that a lot of us in this space are doing, liberation work, social justice work, social engineering, strategizing work, it still is possible to feed into the idea of the only way for me to be of value is to perpetually work and to become some sort of, no pun intended, because this is a religious conversation, some sort of martyr to a cause. That is ableism, right? We're allowing ourselves to be exhausted. And I know I think you've had a guest on who talked about rest as being integral to self-care. So that is related to anti-ableist practices. So the metrics that we use to determine our value or excellence, even in your workspace, are really, really critical because we can make them so that you work folks to death, or we can make them so they capture something other than capitalist ideas of, or ableist, because some ableist ideas aren't always capitalist. And that's what I was engaged in, like hyper-perfectionism. Everything's got to be perfect. Everything was urgent. I couldn't turn it off. And things that felt less important relative to the work got left by the wayside. And aren't we all as important as the work that we're doing?
We'd like to think so. This is Jacqui, we'd like to think so. TL, my brain is often working around like roots of or how we got here. So we both are Lewis's and we think we got some southern roots, deep South, South. I'm wondering about the way that whiteness, the trope of white supremacy or white superiority or white expectations, or I'm going to call it whiteness to being capitalism and white supremacy and racial hierarchy and caste, that whole box of ideologies that are also in the church that say this is like, we loved calling it Protestant work ethic for a long time. It was sexy to call it a Protestant work ethic. And it meant something like be plain, have plain shoes, work your butt off and get closer to God. And of course, the people on the plantation that were working their butts off to survive, also took in a kind of Christianized, Puritanized, I don't know all the words I've used to describe it. Yes, yes, love, your knuckles are bleeding, but you're working really hard and you're obeying your master, and that's great. And that's about God. And also you're closer to God because you're working hard. How do you think about that and this ableism in those terms? Did we get here where we are today, where we value, exhausted bodies that don't rest because of the origins of this nation and the people who built it on our backs?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge part of it. And this is where ableism gets really tricky and why it's extremely powerful.
Mhm.
Racism in this country was constructed because ableism exists. Ableism is what allowed white people, white men in particular, white men who stole and murdered a lot of people, stole a lot of things and spaces and people, and murdered a lot of people, to be clear, and a lot more.
Yes.
Ableism allowed them to denigrate people based on constructed ideas of things. It could have been anything, right? Ableism is a shapeshifter. So what ableism does is says, well, okay, here's the group that we want to subjugate. What do they have in common? Let's use that against them. So let's take the right to vote, for example, and people who are labeled women being excluded of the right to vote. Let's just take them. Everybody knows there's Black women and there's Black people. Let's hold that. And Indigenous folks hold that.
Right.
But focusing on deprivation of the right to vote of women, what so-called men in positions of power did was say, you all are intellectually inferior. You all, because you have the anatomical structure that you have, your labor is worth less than ours. Your thought is worth less than ours. The only thing you're worthy of is insert, right? Being pregnant and barefoot and in the kitchen.
Yes, right.
Okay. Deprivation of the vote because of those things. Now, what white women ended up doing was saying, we're not dumb. Those disabled people over there don't deserve to vote. And the Blacks, this is white women, they don't deserve to vote, but we're very different than those two groups of people. Oh, and the felons, those three groups of people.
Yep.
We deserve the vote because we're smart. So don't put us in that camp. The same logic was utilized against Black peoples, right? It's helpful to you all to be working for us nonstop. We are gracious for allowing you to do such labor. And this is your only value in the world, right? Obviously, we knew better, but that becomes internalized. That is also a form of ableism. So you spoke to that. The other piece, though, is that it pits all of our communities against one another.
Sure.
So what Black folks often, interestingly enough, Black abolitionists, enslavement, so Frederick Douglass specifically and others, actually argued in support of everyone's access to the franchise, including disabled people. Whereas, of course, white women were like, let's pit everyone against one another. Now, fast forward a couple hundred years, we are at a place, or 100 years, we are now at a place where, because the narratives have not been correctly shared about how disability has been utilized to literally just construct categories, right? You can create disability by creating standardized tests. And if white men, straight people, Christians, or any other group in power creates the test, all the people who don't do well on the test can literally be subjected to less intelligent, right? And that is literally the construction of intelligence. I'm not making that up.
The bell curve.
Really. And so in order to push back against that, marginalized groups are pushing back against racism, sexism, cis-sexism, name the oppression. But instead of pushing back against the ableism, which harms all of our groups, including disabled folks, and they're pushing back utilizing ableism. So what we end up with is more exacerbated inequities, and then the groups who are all being marginalized because of ableism, right? I just say, I help people, like, racism is racially informed ableism. So ableism, yeah. So if you think about like, oh, Black people are inherently intellectually inferior, Black people, women's shouldn't get paid the same amount for work. These ideas of inherent inferiority and superiority, someone being more valuable or more worthy, some bodies being valid and other bodies being invalid, some people being worthy of resources and others not. All of this is based in ableism. And so for me, it's thinking about how ableism is able to just not just shapeshift and like help inform what even we see as male and female, for example, right? So these people, like the people who had that characteristic, in this case, allegedly like a physical anatomy of penis, let's just say that, could literally say, oh, if the person has purple hair, they could be, or let me back up. For this example, I would say like, instead, if those people, instead of calling themselves men, called themselves women, for example, then we could subjugate all men because they don't have the, like, so when people talk about like the construction of these identities, you can create criminality, you can create disability. And in fact, criminality and disability have been imposed on all marginalized groups, and they're used interchangeably. And so for me, talking about disability justice is much broader than talking just about disability. It's talking about how categorizations and classifications of people can be easily constructed. Who speaks English? Who stole enough land? Literally, like the first naturalization laws in the nation were related to people who, white men who had been on stolen land for 2 years, who were of good moral character. Those were the people, those white men were the only people who could become naturalized citizens in the nation. So it's all connected in that way. I'm going to be quiet and let you ask me more questions.
No, I don't want you to be quiet, but I do want to say back to you something that I think is a really powerful insight I'm having from the way you're speaking about this, TL. Ableism is the worldview. And the worldview of ableism is shape-shifty and insidious, and can create categories that cause these other oppressions to happen. But the core worldview is the ableism. Is that what you're saying?
I think that would be a fair statement. Mm-hmm. Specifically when we're thinking, and it's not the worldview, it's the white supremacist Christian hetero, like it's this worldview that we're existing under colonization and imperialism. Absolutely right, because we know indigenous wisdom tells us not that, oh, so if indigenous folks were to see or hear or touch people using different languages than themselves, it's not, oh, that's inferior and mine is better. It's, oh, that is different and there are many, right? There's no value on that. Yep. It is what it is, right? And that is how indigenous wisdom and disability justice is indigenous wisdom, to be clear. Yeah. But under colonists' perspective, it's about domination and subjugation. There has to be people in positions of power. There have to be people. Somebody has to be in, somebody has to be out. Yeah. So just, and the reason I'm wanting to say this, like when I preach, and I love to clarify words, for me, for us, I do think I'm sitting at so many tables where people are saying, that's not my thing. That's not my thing. So I want this to be our thing, is what I'm trying to say to the people who are here. So our shared thing is starting with papal bulls, like, please take your little white selves across the pond, and you may have the land if the heathens are on it, and you may live on it for 2 years and it's stolen, and you may be naturalized citizen and you're in charge. Okay, that white supremacist male, so-called male hegemonic power over, all the words that you all would use. I'm wanting you to translate for yourself, people who are listening and talking to me. And TL, this is Jacqui. Like, what would you put in that?
That is the worldview. That it is caste, it is color, it is, I call it whiteness. So you call it what you want to call it. So you find your way in this say yes, yes, oh yes. That is ableist and can use any identifier to crush the souls and justice of others. Skin color, breasts, penises, not penises because I have it, skin color, breasts, eyesight, language, I mean, everything, right?
Right, absolutely. And then what's really the most important piece about ableism is that you don't have to be disabled to experience it, which we're just talking about, but also that ableism kills everyone, right? So like, I guess the pandemic is probably a very unfortunately good example. Disabled folks are dying in droves, disproportionately highly. And we know that many of the people who died after contracting COVID weren't disabled. Right. So it's not an either or. It's like, nah, we got to talk. Everybody is being harmed by this. Or thinking about structural inequity.
Yes.
People talk often about the easiest examples like curb cuts. Everyone's like, oh, well, everybody uses the curb cuts. But folks don't often realize that curb cuts were literally fought for by disabled people. So now it's been normalized now, are glasses.
Yeah.
Oh, fashion statement. But other things, not so much. So it depends on people in positions of power determining what is good and what is bad. Are glasses cool or are they problematic? Which one? Depends on where you are. Depends on whose company you keep, who's in power in the company that you keep. Because some houses, maybe in that house, people are proud because everyone's wearing glasses. And maybe there's one house where, only one person is wearing glasses. Oh, you're strange. Let's bully you. Oh, what have you. But who makes those determinations? And pop culture teaches us a lot of that. So if we want to talk about young people and the church and the church's involvement, and we can look at depictions of who is good and bad in the Bible, which is often cited.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a minute, because a lot of the people here today are from Middle Church, and the ones who will circulate this again will be from Middle Church. I mean, I would love for you to give I would love, TL, I don't know fully your faith story, but how horrible is the church? How horrible is, I mean, let's just get it out, right? Because it's horrible. I mean, the whole idea that, I'm sorry, but I'll say it and then you can pick on me, right? Here's how you know Jesus is Jesus. Because the blind, did not the blind see? No. Did not the lame walk? Did not how horrible is the church? And do you still go to it? Did you break up with us because we're so crazy?
Yeah, so the church is not crazy. The church is harmful and violent. I identify as a mad person. There are a lot of crazy people in this world, and madness is like a really important state of being. But the church has caused people to really devalue other people. Yeah. Concepts around hygiene and drug use, indigenous wisdom, medicines from the earth are deemed problematic. People using them, are deemed inferior, not worthy. Ideas around gender and how roles in society. Why do y'all care what I'm doing with my life? It's seriously, right? Can't we all just be happy and make sure other people can be happy too? Shouldn't that be the goal? And, a couple of weeks ago, I was, and I'll pull it up before this conversation is over, but I found a meditation, someone on TikTok, a Black creator on TikTok was reading a meditation. And one part of the meditation, I kept repeating over and over again. And it said, who would you be if you knew your soul would not be judged?
That's so
how free, right now in this moment, I don't want to get too far into things, I was in the church. Like I can quote a Bible, I could sing the songs, all the things, in multiple languages. Like, and I am a much healthier person now than I ever could have been while I was a part of many different churches. I'm a military kid on top of being a child of a pastor. So yeah. And it's really important that we acknowledge that our society, white supremacy, is informed by the church. And like our ideas around so much is so flawed because of what we've been sold as truth. And that truth that often can't be refuted because the people who are spewing that truth, their truth, utilize a book of faith that it's like you can't fall back on that thing when people are approaching you with rational responses that refute or challenge your perceived worldviews. So it becomes this really difficult game that costs people our lives, in particular queer and trans folks, low and no income folks, ideas of deservingness. And I have to name, especially around, because we're talking about enslavement, and our folks are formerly enslaved on both sides of my family. I need white people to really understand what we're talking about with the construction of impoverishment and dependency as well.
I would like
My
to.
ancestors were brutalized and worked for generations, our entire bloodline being possessed, owned by white people. At the time of legal emancipation of Black peoples, there was no remuneration, there was no reparation, there were no material supports provided.
Right.
And guess what happened? A new category of dependency arises. And what do you know? The people in power, white men and women, decided that that group of dependent people were also not deserving of anything. So I tell people what the United States is very good at is requiring that people have access to things and depriving whole swaths of people of those things, whether we're talking about safety, food, family, right? What do they call it? Neutral nuclear family and all this. Y'all still separate in families. We got all sorts of institutionalization, incarceration. And then we say, oh, but those groups that have been made dependent because of deprivation and violence for generations, made disabled, right? Because we know that deprivation and oppression is a cause of disability, which is why you will find more disabled people in Black, low income, queer, and other marginalized communities, because y'all have worked us to death, because we're anxious to death for our kids dying by the hands of all sorts of systems, because we're living in asthma and cancer alley. These are disability issues. Most of the people killed by law enforcement of the names that we know, they're disabled folks because they live at the margins of the margins. It's very hard in the US context to be Black, queer, houseless, incarcerated, name them, woman even, and not have a disability because of how we're treated, right? Because racism determines who gets access to resources, who's seen as valuable. And people who have less resources, more likely to be disabled. And in the US context, under capitalism, if you cannot work in the ways that are deemed valuable, you cannot earn enough to be stable. So we're talking about cycles of nonstop oppression and deprivation. And then people like to act surprised that people don't have access to things. It's like y'all stole that. No, y'all really stole that in a real way.
Stole it and continued. This is Jacqui, stole it and continued to withhold it. You know, TL, I apologize that I did the church is crazy. I'm going to take that deeply into, don't be talking about what's mad and crazy, harmful, broken. Yeah. So I would love for you to define disability. I'm thinking people are like, really? They're disabled if they're what? Is emphysema disability? Yes. Is cancer disability? Yes. Is high blood pressure disability? Yes. Can you just put some more, can you
Yeah.
enlarge our imagination of the way these systems disable people?
So white supremacy tells us that disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits someone's major life activities. That's one definition under white supremacy. We also have the Social Security definition. Like each of these systems has their own definition of disability. So I want to like plop that over here. Like our government has decided what disability is, and it doesn't capture the essence of what disability is. I tell people that the more I learn about disability, the less I know. And that is actually how radical Black queer folks have tended to approach most things, right? White supremacists want a checklist. Black folks are like, hey, let's be in conversation. Indigenous, so hey, let's talk about this. Like, let's work through it together, right? We're not a checklist kind of thing. If we want to get liberated, that's going to require some conversation and some building and some unlearning and some apologies and like a lot of that stuff, right? Disability justice activist Patty Byrne talks about what disability is from a very, and let me back up one more step. So what I just defined for you. Yeah, go ahead, Jacqui.
Yeah, can I interrupt 1 second? This is Jacqui. Benwin, can you drop the things that TL is saying in the chat for us? Okay, just because I think this is thank you so much, Ben. Go ahead, TL, forgive me.
Yeah,
Please.
and then I'll also drop some links in the chat as I bring them up so people can refer back. So there's different models of disability. I find that a lot of religious people, church folk, even if you don't identify as religious, people raised in churches have a very particular perspective on disability, often based in like ideas around sinning, ideas around not praying enough, and then also ideas around pity or patheticness. So, or magical cures being indication that you believed enough in some sort of higher power.
Can I pause you there?
Yeah, pause me, go ahead.
I'm going to pause you because I think it's so important to just, really, someone's going, do you all understand what TL is saying? That there's a whole biblical teaching that the reason somebody's blind is because of the sins of the father or unwell, because I mean, think about some of our miracle stories of filled with demons, which is mental illness type story, but then miraculously cured and having those demons sent into a pigsty. I mean, the stories in the Bible of how bad behavior leads to disability, and if you're good enough, you'll be cured. And if you didn't get cured, you didn't get good enough. Are you all listening to that and going, yep, I hear you, Jacqui? That is a strong, not just evangelical thread.
No, and it's not. And I think a lot of people do like to say, oh, well, that's the evangelicals. I'm like, no, that's across the board, y'all. Like we are all, we've got problems, folks who are in the church, and these are things that can be addressed. They don't have to be left unaddressed. Right. And I think that one of the things I'll say about that in particular, and then I'll get back to defining disability, is that what that does is make it impossible for disabled people to get any support in the church. Think about it. If the only lesson I've been taught by the person I call my pastor, the person who's shepherding me, is that to have a disability is to mean that someone in your bloodline sinned, or that you yourself have not repented sufficiently, or whatever these parables end up telling us, whatever the moral of the story is, then why would I go into the church and be like, yo, my brain, like, I can't turn my brain off. I'm feeling off. Like, why would you think you would get any empathy, any support? And in fact, what you usually get, especially around mental health disabilities, which, mind you, in the poorest communities exist often because of the environmental factors. So while you tithing your 10, 20, 30, half your money's going to this church, stuff around you is falling through. You don't have enough time for your kids. You don't have enough money to pay for, people are hungry, you're frustrated, energy, you're taking things out on the kids, you feel guilty about that, your partner's not around, maybe other things are happening. There's reasons why we feel the ways that we do. And like, to fail to acknowledge that as a collective group of people who claims to love and care about people is deeply, deeply troubling and very, very gaslighty, right? And also very harmful. And it's the reason why so many people who are in churches die by suicide, have immense other disabilities.
Anxiety. Yeah,
anxiety. And also tend to have really poor coping skills. And like, not coping, like cope with the issue, but like coping with the shame, because you've been shamed by your church for things that are out of your control your entire life, right? Especially people born in churches. You don't know anything else if you're not reaching outside of church. And we know that church mentality is, oh, everything you need is here, right? Everything you have, call on somebody if you need help. But like, you can't in many of those instances. And also, when we're talking about churches creating ideas about gender, I don't go to my house because this doesn't work for my family. All of them go to church, right? But I don't feel comfortable there. I'm misgendered. I don't know how to have conversations about it because everything comes back to rote, being in disagreement with it because the Bible, it's not in alignment. Like, do you want your child to be happy? Do you want a relationship with your children?
Yeah.
Or do you want to continue to judge people based on ideas that were constructed by people who didn't even have your best interest at heart?
Absolutely, TL. I am so resisting the urge to say, please come to Middle Church where we're just slightly better than that about these issues. And I say that only to say, what we need to be listening to deeply as religious people or churchy people is all the ways in which what you're saying applies to us as well. It does apply to us. That I'm saying church, all the church, that the core, let's say the core worldview of the church is you're broken. There's something wrong with you. And the way you get it fixed is Jesus comes and fixes it for you. And actually, if you will participate in your own healing by being as un yourself as you can be, if you fall out of the frame, right? The circle I'm making there. So I think that's a deeply flawed thing about religion, in the way that religion, the Niebuhr brothers would say, Kelly Brown Douglas, lots of writers, including this one about fierce love, like what's broken about religion, what's broken about church is we are not often enough, not often enough, nor strident enough about being a worldview that is about healthy living for humankind. It's more about an oppressed, squashed ego on the planet and parachuting into another life in which you might still not be able to be yourself. That is a way in which the church is empired. So the church is ableist.
I think it's safe to say, and I've never thought about this aloud because I try not to talk to church folks. No offense, but it's a very activating and difficult thing to do.
I'm sorry for that. I'm really sorry for that.
Yeah, but I think I think it is safe to say, just kind of thinking aloud as you're talking to me, I think that a lot of the principles of Christianity are diametrically opposed to disability justice. And thinking just specifically about the thing that you named, disability justice says that each person, as they exist, as they breathe, is whole, is perfect, is beautiful.
Mhm.
Honoring the whole humanity of a person, even in on your worst day.
Yeah.
We love you. You are deserving of life. You are deserving of resources simply because you exist, not because you preached well on Sunday, not because you sang, not any of that other stuff. Irrelevant. Disability justice says like your existence makes you worthy. It is the antithesis of capitalism. It is the antithesis of white supremacy. It is the antithesis of religiosity, wherein you need other things. Now, it doesn't say that you by yourself can, get all the things you need. In fact, the opposite. Disability justice says interdependence, says that we get our needs met by all of those around us, and that practice is a practice of love. Like disability justice, I think this is a quote by Mia Ming, is that I have a shirt that says it, disability justice is love. And I know that's something that you all talk about, radical love, often at Middle Church. So it's definitely connected.
Absolutely connected to our, and I'm going to say before, no, I can't even say that. So don't lie. I was going to say before the religion of Jesus is bastardized, because I think it's bastardized by the time it gets called Christianity. Okay. But before the kind of faith of Jesus, let's say the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself, feed the hungry, take care of the lost, that kind of fierce love teaching that is actually across many religions, TL. As soon as it gets out the gate, as soon as it catches air, something catches, it doesn't stink till it has air, right? As soon as it has air, as soon as it gets out of the gate, it is weaponized. It is bastardized, weaponized, empired. I wish I understood better why, but I agree with that critique wholeheartedly. And I find myself thinking, so to go back to just ask you to say, so disability the way you want us to think about it, and then disability justice. So we can just put our hands around, here is another way to think about that. Like not the, oh, they can't walk, or what, just so give us more on that definition of disability and what is disability justice?
Yeah. So back to disability, you can't define it. And that upsets people a lot, but you can see it if you're looking for it.
So
and if you have the context, right? Mm-hmm. So you, as a Black person in the United States, and you've lived a while and you're from the South, you're Black.
62 years old. Yeah.
I wonder, when you hear the sound of a siren, if you're driving your car, if you see the flashing lights of a police car, do you have any particular feelings in you? Do you feel a particular way?
I have chronic allergies, and not only from some black mold that happened in an apartment that I was in, but the stress in which I live my Black life. I'm on the plane and the people's masks are off and I can't breathe. Mine is on and I can't breathe because their masks are off. Because I know my lungs are tender. And I know that I've been so lucky to not get COVID, because if I get COVID, it's gonna fuck me up. I know that. I also, yes. So the sound of the siren, the sight of a punch, the violence that was a part of my childhood that I can see and feel, and it traumatizes me. I am anxious today and tired today, not from being on the plane, but from the world. These last 2 weeks, from the dismantling of Roe v. Wade to all the shit that happens around it, y'all forgive me, we can't even get shared language about how to ask for what we want. So yes, I have a reaction to those triggers.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'll just pause for a moment to honor that.
Thank you, TL. Yeah.
I want to also acknowledge that I do see questions are coming in the chat, and we're gonna get to the question that I'm looking at now regarding disability and accessibility.
Yes, great.
Okay, so I told you all the legal and medical and educational, traditionally educational model of disability, which is this idea of something being broken in an individual. There's a social model of disability that says that disability wouldn't exist but for the attitudinal and structural and physical barriers that are established in a community, whether that be a church building, whether that be the classroom atmosphere, whether that be your church, maybe people wearing too many scents. I'm also very sensitive, can't breathe in a lot of ways. And I think it's important to acknowledge that all of those things are true. I think people would have disabilities whether or not society established didn't have. So if, like, assuming a fully accessible society, disability would still exist. So I don't have a definition of disability other than like a lived embodied experience that is in this context, in this era, at this moment in time, different from the dominant majority's perspective on how a body mind should function. So I know I don't know if folks are following, but like it has to be a lived embodied experience, and it has to be experienced, and that's why it's back up. So I tell people that disability is relative, it's fluid. So what white supremacy tells people is disability is one thing. And what I'm telling people is no, like in any given moment, disability could like exist or not exist in the same body mind. So in one moment, I can be experiencing disabilities and others not. And I think that that is a really difficult thing for especially people who are really instructed to believe that disability is stagnant. And that is the most harmful thing. And that is why you probably feel differently in different environments, right? You could breathe in some environments. You still are a disabled person, but it's not activated in particular moments.
Right. And TL, I would join you right here, right there. I want to say the thing that is unlocking in me right now is how important it is for people to not imagine that I'm disabled. That's important. So if I were on a television show or a radio show and I'm talking about lots of spaces, not this one and not with you. If I were saying, as a person with a disability, I need to better learn how to manage my stress. Or as a person with disability, you're not wearing your mask freaks my body out. Or, I'm not, that doesn't fit in the way you're describing something that's fluid and at one time this and at another time that, same body mind. I really resonate with that. And my second comment would be, and is there liberation in me claiming that for myself, no matter what?
Yeah, this is TL. I think it's important for Black and Brown folks to be able to claim a disabled identity. It is a political identity around which we organize. And the constant need for, one, white people for generations have been able to define what disability is, and that is the inherent problem. Yeah. When I mentioned, disability, when you know what you're looking for, you mentioned your household.
Yes.
I'm sure now with some knowledge that you have, you can look into your household back then and presently and say, oh, this person's disabled. They got these disabilities. That person had that. Oh, that's where I got that from.
Yeah. Yeah.
But our communities talk about disability differently. So Black, Indigenous folks have been talking about disability within our communities. We don't use Western language to do so. So when I am feeling off, ITL, I do not call my friend, Dustin is usually who it's going to be, and say, oh my gosh, I'm in the midst of a mental health crisis. I need to, I'd be like, yo, bro, bro, come through, or whatever it is, right? I don't have to say those things. My community knows, right? Because my experience is so similar to those who are around me, right? And so it's again a devaluing of how Black and brown folks have talked about.
Yeah.
Me and Dustin created a whole playlist called Disability Solidarity Playlist. It's all Black music from all these generations, many different languages, not using the word disability, but talking about disability. Tupac, I see no changes. I wake up in the morning and I ask myself, is life worth living? Should I blast myself? Goes on to talk about my stomach hurts, so I'm looking for a purse to snatch. In 4 bars, Tupac Shakur just did more talking about disability justice, economic inequality, the environmental impact on the body, mind of Black poor folks, right? Why violence is happening inside of our communities, talking about suicidal ideation. But he's not saying I'm disabled, right? If you ask Pac, are you disabled when he was alive? He wouldn't be like, yeah, I'm disabled, because we don't engage.
Just Pac. He's just Pac. He's Pac.
We are who we are. And that's what's cool about how Black and brown folks engage with our lived experiences. And the problem with that, it's not a problem, but the conflict or tension that arises in the US and the global capitalist kind of empire is that we then are denied access to that humanity. So when Black people escaped enslavement, instead of people being like, well, I'm sure the Black folks was like, good job, bro. The white people were like, oh, that looks like a disability. It looks like you're obsessed with freedom. We're going to label you mentally ill, and we are going to incarcerate you elsewhere or punish you until you get that whipped out of you. So the reasons why Black and brown folks don't identify as disabled is because of this long history. And I think identifying and shifting the social cultural conversations around disability such that we are able to say, I am in fact disabled, means that now I get access to program services, resources, et cetera, or at least we can make the case under this capitalist confines to get those resources. But so long as many folks aren't talking about disability, at least, and I don't think Black folks have to identify as disabled. I actually disagree with a lot of white disabled folks who are like, say the word disabled. I think it's important that we know that, but it is not safe for Black people to always just be out and disabled, right? Because that means more surveillance, more control, more deprivation of our rights and autonomy, not less in many cases. But that doesn't always have to be the case if we were to see disability through the disability justice lens. Patty Byrne, who I was talking about earlier, has 5 ways to view disability, and I don't have it pulled up, but the one that, and I'm going to pull it up in a second, but the one that I want to like really uplift and pause with while I go and search for the other 4 is, well, there's 2. One I already mentioned, a lived embodied experience. And the second that I want to uplift here is that it's a identity from which we organize. So I'm going to pause. I'll let you talk. I'm going to pull the rest of them up and drop them in the chat.
I'm synthesizing for myself, right? And I'm thinking to myself, there's something really dynamic in what you're describing there, TL, that is both something about white Western capitalist definitions, need to codify, cast, classify, that are not expansive, that are not liminal, that are not elastic. These are some words that are coming to my mind that are not spacious containers in which to say, this whole thing, Jackie can't breathe. I've been coughing for 12 years. 12 years after 5 years of allergy shots. And my husband sometimes just is like, you think the coughing is normal now? Is that what it is? There's something about that. But so on the one direction of what you're saying is there is a naming that isn't ours, that is not big enough, wide enough, expansive enough. That's one thing I feel like is an important thing for us to take away. The other thing is, I'm going to say this little quick story. One of my cousins, when we were younger, would just sit and just rock, all the time, right? And as I've grown older to understand a little bit, was that a spectrum thing, or was it a self-soothing thing, or like just to be curious about it? I'd be curious about it now, but it just was her. It was just Kathy. So there's another place in which just us being who we are is a very powerful place from which to organize. And I think that like, if anybody at Middle Church just like that was the one thing, that the ableism is about not being truly who we are. And this disability justice, on the other hand, conversation is about all the worthiness, the beauty and complexity of every body, just because that body exists and deserves love and dignity. I just think, yes, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's it. And it's internalized ableism that makes folks not want to identify as disabled. And it is, like you said, the normalization of it. So I actually almost passed away, I guess, last year. I haven't talked about this publicly at all, but also for like 15 years was on top of all the organizing that I just told you I was doing and working and going to law school full time, I was in pain that I literally felt like I was going to die monthly. Apparently had fibroids that I didn't know about that grew to the size of like something massive. But I didn't have insurance during a lot of the time. When I did, I went to the doctors and explained literally what I just said to you all. No, I feel like I'm going to die every month and I'm passing out and I'm losing blood and all of these things. Didn't get any of the, and I got head nods. So I thought, oh, this must be normal. Not to mention that going into gynecology appointments as a trans person, I don't even want to talk about that. So it's like there were levels and layers to it. And I ended up being hyperanemic. I got surgery last year. My heart apparently went to 29 beats a minute. I ended up in the hospital, but and there's an in-between story that's also relevant. I had to get iron infusions before. It was so urgent that I got the surgery because I was so hyperanemic and this thing is moving around in my stomach and a whole mess. I'm in pain. I'm passing out randomly. And I thought I did not know because I had told these white doctors and they seemed to nod it along. So I thought, and I don't talk about these things with people, right? Our families are very private. We don't necessarily have open conversations about these things. I'm not talking to what I mean? And didn't know. But it's yeah, disability justice is about coming into yourself and still loving who you are, despite what society has told you. So I'm a rocker too. And a lot of folks are. I actually have a theory about, especially for Black and Brown folks in the US, about our what is called our brains and our bodies and how we navigate things. The problem is if the metric is white men or white women, what are we diverging from? And there's a good piece by, I'm gonna drop this in the chat too, talking about maybe Black people can look toward calling ourselves neuroexpansive or something. My theory is just that a lot of children are completely free in their body minds and it is beaten out of us. So in fact, you might be a rocker because as you talked about your cousin,
I was rocking.
you began to rock and it looked very comforting. And I enjoyed watching you rock. Because I'm a rocker, I appreciated it. And when I look back on my life at my mother, she would rock in the bed. She would rock herself to sleep. And my father would rock her to sleep. Those things were normal. It didn't register to me that everyone wasn't doing that, and my family certainly they don't identify as disabled in any particular way. And I don't think that's important because you know what? They were doing what they needed to do to care for one another.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters at the end of the day, you know? And so, you know, in other contexts, people might be like, well, that's strange. Look at
Are
these
you
weird
rocking?
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, but yeah, it's
I'm never still. I'm always in motion, and that's just me.
yeah,
And I'm happy with it. That's just what it is.
yeah. And do you. And that's how Black folks kind of navigate the world anyway, in many cases, until we get to the folks who like to control other people.
Yeah, there's that. So maybe Till, I'm gonna say our community is a church, but it's a community. And it's multi all things, and some of the people are atheists because they don't really care, they just like the music. What could communities do to develop anti-ableist or disability justice practices? Like what's the best place to start?
Yeah, this is Tia. I think being in conversation with other folks who identify as disabled is really important. To be able to have the conversation we just had, and to be told that it is in fact not just okay to identify as disabled, but not like you part of the family, like join the club, like let's go. Now even just that orientation, you're like, oh snap, okay. And now you have a community of people, because there's a lot of folks who have that, and you can now join those groups and get from the people who have chronic coughs, chronic, whatever your disability particularly is. They have the answers. We have the answers to healing our own communities, to providing the support that people need. Now, when you go into the medical system with your same disabilities, because of the medical racism, capitalism, and ableism that I just described, and queer antagonism, and really they're trying to like murder a lot of marginalized folks off, but like that's a whole other conversation. You won't necessarily get the support I'm talking about you, Jacqui, need from a doctor, because they have pathologized whatever your disability is, whether that's a chronic illness, whether that's a mental health disability, it's been pathologized. And because you're a Black woman, how you're received is going to be different than the other people I'm looking at on the screen, which will be different than how I'm received. So I would say when we're talking one of the other 3 points is like, it gives you a community, having that disabled identity. So now you know, okay, I can go to these folks and ask them what they do. And we literally have whole groups of folks with the same disability saying, hey, what do y'all do when you're stressed out because just got off of a plane and you forgot to go to the bathroom, you forgot to eat, you forgot to pause, you forgot to get grounded before you have it. What do y'all do to try to, and people have answers, have real answers. It's the reason I told you when you got on the screen exactly what needed to happen without knowing you, right? It's because I'm part of disability communities, and I'm aware in ways that non-disabled people could never be, in ways that the medical industrial complex not just could never be, but doesn't want to be, because you would be supported and you wouldn't need a lot of the things that they're offering as therapy.
I wouldn't need all that.
Jacqui.
I wouldn't need all that allergy medicine that makes me feel crazy.
Well, yeah, because what would happen is if we were all practicing disability justice, people around you, everybody collectively, even the perfume, there's a whole history of the perfume industry that I'm not going to get into, but you should go look that up. But people would stop wearing scents. If we know as a collective, right, like this is under disability justice. Now we know from the pandemic, we've gotten clear indication that people don't care about a lot of other people because we haven't developed the collective understanding of why we should be caring and loving one another and how. What does that look like? We are not a community in practice, right? If we were a community in practice, oh, boom. Okay, there's an airborne cardiovascular illness. Let's figure out what we need to do to keep everybody safe. Let's make it happen. It would have been just like that. And sure, we would have failed in some places because it was new, because research was still being done. But the baseline stuff, all these people didn't have to die. That was ableism.
Yeah.
We made decisions that certain people's lives were not of value. So the first step is talking to people. Like if you're talking about maybe your church community, it's talking about what ableism is. What does that look like? And how does it show up both in ourselves and in the spaces that we hold dear, the containers we're trying to create or whatever it might be. having disabled folks around, doing some of the education facilitation. I know like the People's Hub is a great group that does developing a disability politic and access-centered practices. So taking up some of those, so you learn, and then you learn to be in practice with one another. And then you learn to shift on the spot. So disability is innovation as well. So something that maybe y'all put in place doesn't work. Hey, let's talk about it in real time. Like even if we had to not do this program today because interpreters didn't show up, okay, nobody gets left behind, right? And
Yeah,
so it's a reorienting of ourselves to humanity is what disability justice is, to ourselves and to humanity.
Reorienting ourselves to humanity.
I think so.
I love that. I'm going to stop talking and see who wants to ask you a question. This is just so good. Thank you. Ben, can you look in the questions things with me and see what's in their chats? Friends, you all have questions that you want to put in the chat, or just how many of us are there? There's 17. Do you want to raise your hand and ask a question of TL?
And this is TL. If nobody chimes in, there was a question that came in earlier that I would like to just at least touch on.
Why don't you just do that one? Just do that one, please.
Yeah, so this is TL. There was a question that came in earlier. I'm not going to go find it right now, but it said something to the effect of, doesn't disability justice deal with issues of access in the church? Yes, and I want to emphasize there's a difference between disability rights and disability justice. Interestingly enough, churches are excluded from a lot of the disability right protections that exist. Churches are exempt under federal disability rights laws, separation of church and state until it comes to the time of like
abortion,
stripping people of their rights and dignity and punishing people and surveilling them. So anywho, what that means then is that the law, and even for people who the law does apply to, it cannot be the moral compass because of what I've just explained to you, that marginalized people don't necessarily come out and have some sort of, I need, and also we suffer a lot.
Yeah.
We keep it pushing, we keep on keeping on, and we will show up and yeah, I coughed, but I got through the sermon. Like that's what it looks like, you know, and you recover it, you take however many days it takes you to recover from that, but you generally aren't asking people to accommodate you, often because we don't even know that we're valuable enough to do that. Disability justice interrupts that and says, oh yes, you are. We're gonna talk to the church about sense in the church. Y'all might not be able to control all these other things, but we can control this one thing, and we got community members. And trust me, Jacqui, when I tell you, you're not the only one with sensitivities who haven't said nothing for 15, 20, 30, 50 years.
Right.
We don't know.
Yeah.
But it's an invitation to say that thing aloud. What would happen if you did? Who's gonna hold you? Who's gonna hold you down? Who's gonna hold you up? And that's how you find out who's your real community. Because if it hurts somebody not to wear their favorite cologne to your house or to the church, and it's costing you days of recovery, it's costing you your lungs, that's not the kind of love I want in my church.
Yeah. No, and I love the spectrum of all of that, right? The sense, the uncleanness, dusty places, all the way to COVID is killing us and we won't wear masks. When the steward person today came on the plane and goes, once again, just reminding the master are voluntary, and people clapped. I was like, what the hell? So my cute little, is it Isabella from Peru, who was sitting on my row, and I were like, we got our masks. We'll wear two if we need to. Yeah. Oh yeah, churches don't have to do any of that kind of good stuff. Any other things that you all want to raise with TL in this amazing conversation?
Yeah, and I don't raise the fact that churches are exempt to say that y'all shouldn't be doing stuff. And that's where disability justice takes you above and beyond the law. This is why disability justice is really important. Because if we were saying, oh, all you need to do is abide by the law, churches, the folks who actually should be most accessible in the perfect world, assuming that churches are doing what a lot of churches say they are setting out to do, you would want even the least of these. Everybody should be there, right? Like But instead, we have churches that can't nobody get into unless you're dressed in your Sunday best, ableism, classism, racism, right? The idea that you have to be dressed a particular way to walk up in somebody's church, all of these things. But to say that disability justice will get you where you need to be if you're practicing it, but you won't have a checklist. And it's not going to be a simple process, and it's going to require work. And anti-ableist practice requires a lot of unpacking. So I want y'all to think about this in the same way that you do the work against white supremacy. Lifelong, right? Everybody knows it's not going to stop tomorrow. It'll be forever work. And that's true of anti-ableist, developing your anti-ableist framework and praxis as well, that you're literally unlearning things that you've learned since birth, that you're literally reorienting yourself to yourself and society and your house and people around you. That's really important, and that'll last. It should, if we're doing things right, it'll last forever, because people are always changing. You're always changing. Right. And so, with time, maybe your eyesight gets, maybe you need more support with things that you didn't before. And there's nothing wrong with that. It is what it is. Indigenous wisdom says it is different. There are many. That is what disability justice says. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no value on it. But then it's like, how do we uplift and support everyone? That's important.
Beautiful, TL. Beth Eller is one of our deacons, and what you said about conformity in schools and education really hit me. Even progressive schools still can't accommodate the trauma behaviors I see. Beth, did you want to say anything more about that, or do you want TL to comment on that? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I just appreciated TL addressing that issue and knowing that I mean, even today I was in a school where there was some pretty inappropriate, you know what I'm saying, behaviors among some of the little boys. And it's just like, how do you, I found out that the one I was talking to has an extremely stressful home life. Because a lot of times kids, when they know you're listening, they talk. And how do you accommodate that? I just feel like, the conformity is such a prerequisite of learning. So I'd just like you to say a little more about it, because I think you're just fascinating me in your approach. Thank you.
Yeah, this is TL. I think a lot of ableism is in fact about the idea of there being a normal thing. So a lot of our education, and I always link education, policing, and legal and medical systems all together. If you look at how they operate, very similar. It's about fixing. It's about making normal, and the standard of deviation is set by people who often don't even look like, don't have the language of a lot of other people. And conformity, it's conform or die, right? So policing, oh, well, they didn't raise their hand, so I shot them. Okay, what if they couldn't? What if they didn't hear you? What if they couldn't process it? What if they're traumatized, so couldn't respond? They were in flight mode or freeze mode or whatever it might be. So that these ideas about how people should look, behave, sit, even the idea that a child should be able to sit and for however many hours a day, all of those things are like functions of how we have wielded ableism against children in this case. And I would note that ageism is in fact ableism with age on it. And it can go for elders and youth, not just youth. So we should name that as well, which is how we end up with nursing facilities that are incarcerating elders and people depriving elders of autonomy in very similar ways as children are being deprived of their autonomy. And disability justice pushes back against all of those things simultaneously. And it helps us connect those things, because once we see, oh, the reason the elder is being punished is for very similar reasons. There's ideas that the elder can't make decisions, instead of thinking, how can we support the elder in making that decision in a different way that maybe they didn't do when they were a little bit younger, but they can still make the decision with support. those sorts of things. There's just assumptions around so much. And that's why, like, not just youth, but like especially Black youth are very misunderstood. Queer youth, very misunderstood, because often it's cisgender white educators in the space who have no idea what you're looking at, or what, like, what's being discussed by the child, or even what the impact of you contacting the parent might be. And the solutions that we're told will be of benefit to the children is similar to what we were told would be of benefit to enslaved people: more labor, sometimes positive reinforcement of things, but it's often positive reinforcements of things that we shouldn't be reinforcing positively. Like, if the child doesn't want to sit down in the, like, why is that the method of instruction for everyone?
Because
So
about
it's
power and
questioning
control.
yeah, it's about power and control. Like with me, I pull my hair. So one of the things that's very helpful to me is to have a hat on at all times, some kind of hat, but it's banned in classrooms. Wait, why do you care what's on my head? Does me showing up in a hat make me any, you know what I mean? Oh, well, it's a slippery slope. If TL wears a hat, then maybe Joe will. Okay.
Right.
So,
right.
But that's control, that's power. You want to assert dominance. And that's what patriarchy and white supremacy has done. So it's really evaluating that. What are the things that we ask of children that we don't demand of adults who are in positions of power? Are we telling the teacher that they can't eat in class? Are we telling, like, and that's not even considering the other factors that the child is experiencing. And so it's just a very unfair way to assess people. Yeah, the whole education system. I'm also of the mind, there's a group called the Education for Liberation Network. For folks who are in education, you should check them out. But we also talk about abolition of the current educational system. We are not stopping with incarceration, folks. Like, this goes much, much, much deeper. And until we're able to just be honest about how deep this stuff runs, we're going to keep harming our youth and keep harming ourselves. So hopefully we can work through more of that.
TL, I'm so glad to meet you.
Oh, it's an honor.
No, it's an honor for me. And, you know, we'll get back together and talk about which parts of the South our Lewis people are from, so we can figure out what's going on with that.
Sure.
You all, we have been really, I have been really inspired and instructed and encouraged, is what I want to say, by this conversation with TL. TL, can you tell us in the chat where to follow you, find you, so everybody can keep coming to school with your wisdom and your beauty and your straightforwardness? I really appreciate it. And y'all, you know, this conversation is going to be shared with you. Can you think to yourself 3 people you need to share it with, who might just like go, wow, is that what we're talking about? And which of my deacons, Beth, just calling your name because you're here, who wants to help us to think about how we're doing on this? What's our learning goal? What kind of community do we want to be? I mean, really, like, how does this shape we who are in our planning? Ben and I were together yesterday with colleagues, and this is the time of year where we think, who are we going to be? We're talking reparations task force. TL, we have a reparations task force. Okay, cool with that. We're always doing, you know, the anti-racist classes and thinking about a better way to be with our trans siblings. What is our shared work, middle family, around ableism? And how?
Can I name one thing that I noticed when I was looking through the website?
Please.
Even on the abortion piece where y'all are asserting, hey, we support bodily autonomy. It says this is and it names some marginalized groups of whose issue that is. That is a disability issue as well. It affects disabled folks. So even thinking about who is left out and why are they left out, like, okay, let's add that in there and see how that's related, like talking to folks around that, because not only are disabled people disproportionately exposed to sexual violence that what might require healthcare that supports their needs, whatever their needs might be, but also disability is also used as the wedge issue here. This is a disability issue. Reproductive justice is a folks who are still being forced sterilized are often disabled people, and then folks who have always been deprived of autonomy to make decisions about their own bodies, especially folks who could get pregnant, are disabled people or are labeled disabled. So a lot of the people who were incarcerated, who were labeled women in years of yore, were
Right.
incarcerated often due to sexual violence, and many were disabled themselves, and some were just labeled, like Carrie, in the case Buck v. Bell, Carrie Buck and her mother were both incarcerated in an asylum. Both had been sexually abused, and in fact, the younger one had been raped by a wealthy person. The parents sent, the cousins, uncle and aunt, sent her to an asylum, right? These are, and Buck v. Bell, and Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. That was 1927. Buck v. Bell is still the law of the land in the United States. So to not include disability in all of the, whether we're talking about environmental injustice causes disability. If we're talking about incarceration causes disability. If you go into incarceration not disabled, you come out disabled. So queer liberation, most queer and trans folks, because of how we're treated, have disabilities that we've acquired due to all the things,
Right.
and also have less access to healthcare. Disabled folks have less access to healthcare as well. So thinking about who's
Very
being left out and how can we reorient ourselves and center disability is one really relatively simple, but a complex thing, right? It can't just be, oh, we're going to add the word. It's like, we've got to do this analysis. We've got to bring the folks in. We've got to work through this. So that's my suggestion.
I love that. I'm so grateful for that. Thank you. All right, y'all, it's 8:27. Are we ready to let TL get back to TL's world with our gratitude and just like, I cannot wait to keep learning with you, from you. Would love to continue our conversation again really soon. Ben, thank you for hosting. Y'all, thank you for coming. Did TL put how to follow? Yep, okay, in the chat, great.
Yeah, and this is TL. I'm just going to drop a few more things in the chat. It was hard for me to multitask. I mentioned a couple of resources. I'm still pulling them up, so I'll drop them in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know if you all plan to email like registrants,
Yep, we do.
resources.
Yep. we
Okay,
will.
so, okay, great. And maybe I'll just send them afterwards so we don't hold people up.
No, I
okay.
think we can leave the chat open. Ben and I often leave the chat open for just that
Great.
thing. A couple more
So if
questions.
you just want to send them over, I can just include them in the email we send out tomorrow.
Okay,
Good
great. I
report.
have both. This is TL. I have both of your emails, so I'll go ahead and do that. And thank you both for your time.
Thank you for your time.
Thank
Be
you.
well, okay.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care,
Thanks
everyone.
to the
Bye-bye.
Access team also.
Thank you all.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Nice to meet you, Jackie.
Nice to meet you too, TL.
My honor.